Okay. So we will make a start. So I'll begin just by, as is customary here in Australia, by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. So joining us today from the UK is Dr. Suraj Lakhani, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Sussex. And Suraj is going to talk to us about the nexus between video gaming and violent extremism. So we have the full abstract and Dr. Lakhani's biography on the AVERT website, of course, but he's published some recent articles and chapters on gamification and extremism. If there are in 2024 a book on gaming and extremism, which I believe is the first collection in the field to come out. That's from Routledge. In 2023 in Perspectives on Terrorism, and 2022 in Terrorism and Political Violence. Okay, so we'll get started in a moment. Just before we do, one note of housekeeping. Please, if you have questions, do feel free to put them into the Q&A box, which should be available to everybody just down the, we all know how to use Zoom these days, I think. But please do put them in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we'll have questions and answers time at the end of the paper. All right, over to you, please, Dr. Lakhani.
Great, thank you, Helen. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Good evening or good morning to everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you for inviting me to present today. I'm really pleased to have been invited to join this well-regarded network, well-respected network, and also really pleased to be able to talk to you today. So I'm going to be talking about the nexus between video gaming and violent extremism. Even though the topic is gaining kind of a lot of importance across academia, policy circles, and across industry, most people working in and around terrorism studies have relatively little knowledge about it. So today's presentation aims to provide an overview of the intersection or the nexus between video gaming and violent extremism. I'll outline some of the key issues, and if I have time, I'll cover some of the potential solutions for starting to resolve these issues as well. And if anyone is interested in learning more, getting a real kind of depth in understanding of the topic, there's a growing body of fantastic research and literature I can share later. It's also important to mention before I start that there are a couple of slides in here that do contain extremist content as a pre-warning. So I'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes and they'll leave us some time for some Q&A afterwards as well. So it's probably good to start with a bit of a background, provide a bit of a primer to gaming, which most of you in the room will know. I'm sure we've got lots of gamers amongst us, but gaming is king above music, film and TV. It's the most profitable sector. In 2024, revenues are expected to be somewhere around $282 billion US. It's not niche. There are a huge amount of people around the world who are gamers, 3.3 billion around the world to be exact. That's a figure that's concentrated mainly amongst 16 to 24-year-olds. And the gender split is around 50-50, where 40 to 50% of gamers are female, and the highest concentration are based in the Asia Pacific region. These 3.3 billion people cover all kinds of gamers, from people who spend numerous hours on consoles or PC-based gaming, to those who play Candy Crush on their phones. The number of people who engage in online gaming is far less than this, but it still kind of hits the tens and hundreds of millions. So we're still talking about a substantial amount of people who play online gaming, who interact with other people and that's really where the issue lies. And that's what we'll be talking about. Well, that's where the main issue lies, and that's what we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail. But it's also important to mention the kind of pro-social benefits of gaming for many of us who are gamers. It's a form of escapism. It's a form of stress relief. For some people, it kind of forms their identity. It forms who they are as a person. It helps them to build communities around the world. It helps them to build friendship circles around the world. It's fun for other people, and it's more than just entertainment. It's it's really kind of the social spaces that many people inhabit, and where for some actually quite a lot of their social interactions take place. It's also important to mention, also to kind of say that video games are not a causal factor of violence. We don't want to vilify video games, just like we don't want to vilify social media platforms. It's the people who use them, it's the people who abuse them, it's how they're used that's the issue. But there is one kind of caveat to that, there is some evidence, there is some research out there to suggest that video games can desensitize people to violence. But again, that's not the same as being a causal factor of violence. So when we think about different gaming platforms, when we think about gaming adjacent platforms, which I'll talk about later, when we talk about online gaming, we can see huge kind of uptake, huge amounts of users around the world. Discord, which is a gaming adjacent platform, where people can form different networks, they can build communities, and can chat to one another during gaming, can send texts and images and other different types of material to each other, either during gaming or outside of gaming. Has a huge amount of monthly users, around 150 million monthly users. There's 19 million mostly private servers on Discord, and they have somewhere in the region of 600 million accounts. Now, we know Discord has been used quite a lot by violent extremists, different tactics to kind of share propaganda, to recruit, to disseminate manifestos prior to an attack, as we saw with the Buffalo attacker. But we'll come to that in a moment. But as we kind of look down the list, Xbox Live, Roblox, which is another platform, another kind of gaming platform that's seen increasing issues with the exploitation of from by violent extremists, has 77 million daily users. Quite frighteningly, 42% are under the age of 13. Frightening in the sense that as it's been misused by violent extremists, the potential target audience of propaganda or that recruitment is actually quite young. But yeah, as we go down that list, we can see kind of huge amounts of users for all different types of online gaming spaces. And when we look at the kind of growing research in this area of study, and I must say, research has been going on in looking at the intersection between video gaming and violent extremism for a number of years, but it's only really started to gain a mass and take shape over the last few years. And some of the research that we've seen coming out over the last few years has looked at the types of harms and the encounters with extremism that some gamers are facing. So on the slide there, you can see broken down by region, the percentage of respondents who kind of come across statements or the use of physical violence against a particular person or a group based on their identity. You can see that's quite high in the United States at 35%, 25% in the UK, and across the board when we look at the different tables there. I'm not going to focus on them. Focus on these ones now because I've got other ones I do want to show you, and I will run out of time if I do focus on each table individually. I'm happy to share my slides afterwards if people want to take a look. But this was a piece of research undertaken by New York University, and it's available online as well. But the ADL have also annually undertaken research looking at the harms associated within gaming, and we can see there that in 2021, there was roughly an 8% exposure to white supremacist ideologies within online games, something that more than doubled a year later in 2022. So we can get, indications like this that the issue is growing quite substantially. And that 15% of young people ages 10 to 17 reported exposure to white supremacist ideologies in 2022. So if we think about the tens or hundreds of million people who game online, and then a percentage of that will be aged between 10 to 17, or 15% of that is a pretty high number of people who've been exposed to white supremacist ideologies as well. And we can see that in terms of harassment as well. Year on year, harassment within multiplayer games experienced by gamers has increased to quite a substantial point, 77% in 2022. This was a piece of research that was undertaken by a couple of colleagues who were commissioned by the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and undertook some research where they interviewed a relatively large number of gamers back in 2022. And whenever I show the slide, I ask people to kind of focus on the right-hand side column. So when we ask those gamers different questions about how much exposure they've had to different forms of hate or extremism, when we look at misogyny, for example, only 18% of respondents had no exposure to misogyny at all. Only 33% of respondents had no exposure to extremism at all. So my maths is correct, 67% did, which is a really kind of huge number. And I know we need to, as academics and as researchers, we need to think about kind of issues around definitions here. Do the people we're interviewing or surveying understand what extremism means? These are really important questions to ask. But even when we take that into consideration, it's still a really, really high number of people who have exposure to these different forms of hate, violence, and extremism. So we've seen in various different contexts, in various different examples, we've seen the different kind of social harms that are associated with violent extremism and the abuse of these platforms by violent extremists and bad actors. We've seen gaming and gaming adjacent platforms being exploited by the far right in the UK, in the US, in Europe, but we've also seen jihadist networks and organizations really dip their toes into gaming in some quite substantial ways over the years. But it's important to say that much of the research has focused on the far right to date. There has been some research out there which looks at jihadist use of video games and video gaming platforms, but it's generally outdated, and there's a real need for in-depth research in this particular area to determine the current landscape. But from the research that seems to be emerging, and anecdotally, the threat seems to be quite prominent from the far right, but that doesn't mean we should take our eye off the ball in terms of jihadist use of gaming spaces and online gaming. So there are a number of different types of typologies that many of us working in this area have identified. Unfortunately, I won't have time to kind of go through all of these in detail today, so I'm going to focus on two of them. I'm going to focus on bespoke games and modifications, and I'm also going to focus on gaming adjacent platforms. Excuse me. Many people have written about some of the other typologies, and again, I'm happy to kind of provide links and access to literature afterwards if anybody's interested in learning a bit more about some of the other typology of harms. Let's start with bespoke games and modifications. So what are bespoke games and modifications? Well, bespoke games are essentially games that have been coded from scratch, not just by violent extremists, by anybody, but the ones we're focusing on today are, of course, ones that have been coded from scratch by violent extremists or produced by sympathizers and supporters of violent extremist networks and organizations. These games are often rudimentary in nature. They're very, very basic. they're, you know, nowhere near the AAA games of, you know, Call of Duty or Halo or Animal Kingdom or Animal Crossing or whatever other game that is a popular franchise or is popular across the world. But that doesn't make them less important. We've seen with research on social media, we've seen with research on image boards, there is a real kind of tendency by some, particularly on the far right, to want to return to a real kind of rudimentary era of the internet, where things are pixelated, where things were not polished, and it only takes one or two of these games to become cult classics for them to have different types of influence across the board. Modifications, on the other hand, are original games that have been changed, have been modified to include different maps, different characters, different backgrounds, different landscapes, and other attributes. The example that I normally give in relation to this is the very popular franchise Castle Wolfenstein, a game that I play, a game that I've enjoyed playing in the past, but we've seen these games modded by neo-Nazis and far-right extremists, where the original kind of idea of the game was you play as a soldier going around killing Nazis and taking over kind of Nazi spaces, whereas the modifications of this game have seen people playing as the Nazi, killing people of color, killing people from the LGBTQ plus community, killing women and other minorities as well. And there are a growing number of these modifications as well. My colleagues at the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, which I'll mention at the end and provide a link to at the end, have started putting together an exhaustive list of different bespoke games and modifications, something that I think is going to be released in a publication relatively soon. But even if we just kind of look between 1991 and 2021 here on the screen, we can see a whole range of different types of ideologies. We can see a whole different range of games here that are either kind of coded from scratch or have been modified as well, from kind of jihadist to far-right extremist, anti-Semitic, and others as well. This is an example of one that was released a few years ago. Many of you will recognize the name at the top of the screen. This was a game called Jesus Strikes Back 2, where you played as different characters in different places around the world, including as Hitler, as Mussolini, as Jesus himself, as Donald Trump. And the game was also updated to include the Christchurch Killer as well, where you played as the Christchurch Killer on the streets of Christchurch, New Zealand, mimicking the horrific attack in 2019, where 52 Muslims were killed across 2 mosques across the city. Within the game, you not only kill Muslims, but also other minorities and people from the LGBTQ plus communities and women and other people as well. ISIS are also an organization who understand the importance of and the value of using gaming in order to increase visibility, in order to disseminate propaganda, in order to be able to occupy spaces with different types of audiences as well. So this was a mod of a popular tactical war shooter, Arma 3, where you play as ISIS fighters. And then we look at Roblox, and all of the material that we come across is really challenging to view. It's really quite frightening. But Roblox, the kind of things we've seen on Roblox is particularly frightening, specifically as we talked about earlier that the ages of people playing Roblox is really quite young. Um, my 6-year-old niece, sorry, my 6-year-old nephew, came home from school recently and talked to me about how him and his friends all love Roblox. My 10-year-old niece in France is constantly playing Roblox, and all of her friends are constantly playing Roblox. And we've seen Roblox being abused by and used by far-right extremists in various different ways. So the way Roblox works is it's a kind of bunch of lots of mini games that people code themselves, and people have made lots and lots of money by coding these games and monetizing these games. But far-right extremists have done things like made games where it kind of outlines a concentration camp, or as you can see in this screenshot where you have kind of social interactions with other neo-Nazis, Nazis, far-right violent extremists as well. And we don't know how young people are who are kind of interacting with this type of material. We've also seen Roblox being used after some of the horrific attacks we've seen over the last few years. So this is meant to mimic Buffalo and the Buffalo attacker who killed, I think it was 12 people in a supermarket in Buffalo on the outskirts of New York. Somebody made a playable game of this, which was available on Roblox. And we've also seen the kind of modification of some existing AAA games as well. I'm just going to play a short video here. So I don't know if you're able to hear the sound there or not, but this was a modification of Grand Theft Auto, as many of you probably guessed, by Islamic State. When this was released in 2014, and once people kind of came across it, and researchers started asking questions about it, and we wanted to know whether it was something that was released by Islamic State Central. Of course, nobody really quite fully knows whether it was released by Islamic State Central or whether it was released by supporter groups. We have a suspicion that it was at least endorsed by some people in Islamic State Central, or at least in the central marketing team. And the other, say, interesting thing, the other thing that kind of struck me about this video is that when I was doing some research for the Home Office, alongside others a few years ago, I came across a video on a video sharing platform, which was not one of the big video sharing platforms like YouTube. It was one of the kind of lesser known ones based in Asia. I came across a video which was a real life video rather than a video game, and it looked exactly like this. There was a bunch of guys driving in a car, I think on a road just outside of Mosul, and they went past a civilian car and just opened fire randomly on the civilian car, killed the driver, killed the passengers. What I couldn't quite work out, even though I did ask a fair few different people, was whether this video was released first or whether the game was modified first. Regardless of whichever one has come first, one has clearly influenced the other, which kind of gives us an indication of how important even groups like the Islamic State, who we would have thought gaming would be considered as haram, within their particular types of kind of dichotomy and ideologies, where even they understand the real kind of importance of engaging with gaming and gaming adjacent platforms. So what is this value of bespoke games? What are the kind of different what are the kind of values of using gaming in one sense, and what is the value of kind of making your own games and modifying existing games for violent extremism? Well, the first one we might talk about is kind of desensitization to particular types of ideological violence. Although there is no evidence to suggest that video games are a causal factor of violence, like I mentioned earlier, there is some research to indicate that they can desensitize people to violence, as I mentioned. Also, there's a question of dissemination as well. The dissemination of propaganda in particular ways that are considered to be kind of fun and exciting. And when we think about, the existential attractions of violent extremism, the kind of phenomenological foreground of violent extremism, we shouldn't underestimate how important these concepts are, particularly with young people. There's also the exposure to particular extremist ideologies that people may not have come across before. So introducing them to new ideologies and groups, providing awareness of them as well. There's also audience reach. So although gamers are a broad range of ages, a vast number are very, very young, as we've talked about, are very young online gamers. So there is the kind of distinct possibility of reaching younger audiences, as we've seen in some of the research on far-right extremism and video gaming as well. There's also the kind of reinforcement of ideologies for those who are already committed. Also want to mention relatively briefly gaming adjacent platforms as well. So there are a number of different gaming adjacent platforms. The kind of three main ones, or the three that people mostly talk about, I've kind of listed on the screen there: Discord, Twitch, and DLive. Discord was launched in 2015, and essentially, if I, as a gamer, if I want to communicate with my friends or with people I've met online during a game, I can either do that within that particular game, or I can do it over Discord. Lots and lots of people, as we've seen, use Discord, and it means it gives people a lot more flexibility. I can log on, have different communities on there, see which games those communities are currently playing, join those games, and be able to converse with some of my friends online. Twitch is a platform that was acquired by Amazon in 2014, but it was a platform, as I'll talk about in a moment, that has been used for some quite horrible purposes, including the live streaming of attacks. But essentially, the core of Twitch was for people to live stream themselves playing video games, and other people to watch live or watch recordings of those videos, and to also be able to interact with the person playing the game and to interact with other people watching the game as well. And DLive is also another live streaming platform as well. So I've kind of mentioned live stream attacks. So in Germany in 2019, in Halle, a 28-year-old man live streamed himself trying to attack a synagogue in the city of Halle, as I've mentioned, in 2019. Buffalo 2022, an 18-year-old man live streamed himself opening fire and killing 10 African Americans in a supermarket. Both of these attacks were live streamed on Twitch. The Buffalo attacker kept a private diary and his plan of attack on a private server on Discord. He sent invites to a small group of people to join the private server and view the diary and attack plans, I think 30 minutes before the attack. As we all know, it only takes a really small number of people to watch and save the live stream video for it to spread like wildfire. An example of this is Christchurch. Although it wasn't live streamed on a gaming platform, it was live streamed on Facebook Live. It was only watched by a real kind of small handful of people, but it spread really, really fast. I think Facebook removed something like 1.4. Facebook stopped something like 1.5 million attempted uploads of the Christchurch attack video within the first 24 hours, and that doesn't include how many actually got through as well, which is a huge amount considering, I don't know, 10, 15 people around that watched the live stream before it was taken down by Facebook. to having 1.5 million potential uploads in the first 24 hours. At one point within that time frame, I think within the first 24 or 48 hours, YouTube reported attempted uploads of the video at 1 per second, something that they described as unprecedented in both scale and speed. Just 3 days later, Facebook said that they had already detected something like 800 visually distinct versions of the video as well. Some of these kind of visually distinct versions of the video were to get around content moderation, or were to get around kind of hashing databases. Other modifications of the video were things like people adding background tracks, like the Friends, the US Americans comedy. People added a Friends kind of background theme song to one of the videos. People were adding kill counts on the top of the screen, and as the attacker went through, horrifically gunning down people, the kill count went up. So we saw some really quite disturbing versions of these videos being made, and also the attempted upload of them to some popular social media sites. Communication is also important to be able to speak to existing networks, particularly as they are aware that gaming online spaces are not monitored or subject to disruption as much as other online spaces, particularly social media platforms as well. There's also the potential to reach out to new recruits, either within gaming or directing people across overlapping online ecosystems. And these platforms have even been used to plan events. So Charlottesville and the January 6th attack on the US Capitol were planned on these platforms. And the events and attacks were even live streamed on these platforms as well by various people involved. There's also the issue of community building and strengthening, particularly something we've seen particularly on Discord, where people can set up their own servers. As you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned there was something like 19 million servers on Discord. So it's really difficult to be able to monitor all of those servers. So people can set up their own servers on Discord, which they moderate themselves. And on those private servers, people can build, either develop existing communities or build new communities, both kind of in terms of purposeful or organic as well. We've seen on places like Discord, certain far-right communities even have even asked people to take pictures of their arm to prove that they're white-skinned before they're allowed into particular servers as well. There's also the issue of radicalization, recruitment, and reinforcing, which is quite self-explanatory. The research looking at radicalization on gaming spaces and gaming adjacent spaces is relatively early stages. As yet, there is no evidence to suggest that these spaces are being used for purposes of radicalization. That doesn't mean that radicalization or attempted radicalization is not taking place in these platforms. It just means that we haven't quite caught up yet in terms of our research, but there are some fantastic colleagues who are at the very early stages of conducting that research. So watch this space over the coming months and years as well. But the other aspects I suppose we need to think about in terms of kind of radicalization, recruitment, and reinforcing, something I've mentioned earlier is the kind of pool of recruits. One question that we ask ourselves continually within this particular area of study is, are violent extremists purposefully targeting gaming spaces because they know that they are less regulated, they are less moderated, and because they understand there will be a particular pool of potential recruits on these sites? Or are they using them in more organic ways where actually they're gamers themselves, so they don't really understand these online spaces? Likelihood it's a kind of combination of both, but what does remain the same is that there are particularly young, vulnerable communities on these different platforms, which are targeted by different extremists and violent extremists. We also need to kind of think about the online extremist ecosystems and how these different platforms fit into that online extremist ecosystem. So if one of these particular platforms has higher disruption rates than others, or updates its terms of service, or encourages people on its platform to increase reporting, well, how do people, or in what ways and how do people migrate to other platforms? Do they go to other online gaming spaces? Are there overlaps with other online ecosystems, around social media and others? And this is something, again, we're really at the early stages of exploring, but something that was worth pointing out, something that's really important and something that we really need to kind of focus on moving forward within this particular area. And cross-border networks as well. And this is something that I guess it's something that's quite obvious to most of us working in the area, working on, looking at the issue of kind of terrorism and the internet. But it was something that was kind of raised as quite important at a UN panel that I was part of in North Africa a few months ago, where they talked about, particularly within regions like North and East Africa, the issues around forming networks across particular borders, across particular geographical borders. And just like social media and just like other online spaces, video gaming really has the ability to do this quite easily for lots of people. But when we think about communication, which we discussed in the last slide, I think we should also talk about communication that happens in mainstream games as well, like Call of Duty, Animal Kingdom, Halo, Rainbow Six, and other games. So it's not necessarily just about radicalization and recruitment, but it's also about the kind of racist, xenophobic, misogynistic hate that's aimed at other players. And that could be within gameplay, or it could be in-game lobbies as people are waiting to go into a game. Just speaking to my students every year within my terrorism module, the amount of gamers I have in my class is usually, around 50% of the class, around 15 to 20 of the students, and pretty much each and every one of them has had some experience of racism or xenophobia or misogyny within online gaming spaces. Many of my female students who are gamers actually turn off their microphones because they say it's just something that gets a little bit too much when people hear a female voice and the amount of misogyny that they face. And then if that person finds out that the person is also of a South Asian heritage, for example, then there's also the kind of intersection with racism as well. Something that my students pointed out, and something that has been reflected within some of the research of late, is that actually lots and lots of people kind of just now accept that this is what gaming, this is what to expect within gaming spaces. So the racism, the extremism, the misogyny, the hate, the Islamophobia, anti-Semitism is something that's experienced on a day-to-day basis by many people, and they just kind of almost consider it as this kind of everyday extremism, something that Nick Robinson up at Leeds kind of has started to write about as well, something that we need to take a little bit more seriously as well, something that people might be becoming quite desensitized to, particularly within online gaming spaces as well. I know I'm running out of time, so maybe I'll go through this pretty quickly and then leave some time for questions and answers. Helen, how much time do I have? Do I have a few minutes?
Yeah, maybe sort of about 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I'll go through
I
this
think
quite
we're all
quickly.
keen to hear you say something about possible solutions, please.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so there are a number of solutions. So it's a whole bunch of them I'm kind of outlining here, but I just kind of wanted to focus on two of them here: user reporting and terms of service and community guidelines. And we can talk about the other ones during the Q&A as well. In terms of kind of user reporting, I suppose, what does it mean in terms of kind of addressing radicalization within gaming communities, or addressing the kind of threat of extremism and violent extremism within kind of gaming communities. Well, one particular aspect of considering the intersection between video gaming and violent extremism is that we know we need more attention on the user or the gamer themselves. So alongside the approaches to counter the threat of violent extremism within these spaces, such as disruption, takedowns, and PCBE measures, on the other end of the scale, we need to think about how we can better encourage user reporting. And I know user reporting is often mentioned in a lot of the regulations that different countries and European Union or Germany or the UK through online harms paper kind of encourages and sets out different recommendations for. But in reality, user reporting normally can be improved in a number of different instances. So we need to think about user reporting as a vital tool that's given kind of due attention. It's imperative that gaming companies understand the importance of providing mechanisms for the reporting of hateful, abusive, and extremist content. With the proliferation of gaming over the past few years, particularly during the pandemic, which has led to the rapid expansion of users for gaming companies, some of the organizations have numerous issues to deal with, and that's transpired within a relatively short amount of time. So we've seen this kind of exponential growth by gaming companies, and they've got a huge amount of issues to deal with extremism being one of them. So they kind of really lack the knowledge and tools to be able to deal with this issue, and on occasion the kind of motivation doesn't exist for some companies as well. But there's some catching up to do compared to kind of the policy, strategies, and mechanisms in place by social media companies, for example, which most of us agree are still kind of in development, though far more advanced as compared to gaming companies. But adequate systems need to be in place to be able to allow gamers to be able to quickly and easily report both contentious materials and other users who kind of break terms of service and community guidelines as well. But we need to think about what the barriers are to reporting, and does it negatively affect the gaming experience? And we need to think about this away from social media and think about it within its own kind of particular issue. So as a gamer, if you experience some sort of hate online, in order to report, would you have to pause the game? Would you have to stop your game? Would it then have some effect on your own gaming experience? Would it, put your gaming experience back? Would you lose a life, within that gaming sphere? Would it, would you be kind of told off by your mates who you're playing online with because you've stopped to report something and they've lost the game? And these are really important things for gaming companies to think about. So how can we first of all encourage reporting, or encourage reporting by users, but also how can we make it a real kind of simple process where they're able to report something without the detriment to their own kind of gaming as well? And also, how do we increase the confidence in reporting? So when we look at lots of research that's come out, and also when we kind of speak anecdotally to people who are gamers, there's not a huge amount of confidence in reporting. So how do we increase this reporting? Do we provide reports back to individual users who have kind of reported an act of abuse to say this is the procedure that we've followed and this is the outcome? And also transparency as well about the issue. So should gaming companies increase transparency by reporting how many takedowns they've had, how many people have kind of broken terms of service, and the different kind of measures they have in place as well. And all of these things, I think, can really help to increase confidence in reporting, something that I think is really quite important to help deal with this issue. I don't think I'll have time to go through the terms of service and community guidelines, but that's something I can talk about during the Q&A, if that's okay. But I will mention the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, which I'm part of. We've brought together over 100 world-leading researchers, practitioners, and policymakers with the private sector to really focus specifically on the issue of and the exploitation of online gaming spaces by terrorists and violent extremists. You can kind of go to our website. We've got lots of resources on there, and if you're interested in this area, then you're welcome to join us as well. There are forms on the website where you can actually become part of the network as well. But that's it from me. So yeah, thanks for listening. I hope that was interesting, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Suraj. That was a terrific introduction to some of the really complex issues around extremism and games and gaming platforms. So I do encourage people to formulate the many questions I'm sure they have and put them into the Q&A box. While folk are doing that, I'm going to take the chair's privilege and ask at least one of my own. So I did want to ask you, as I was saying, as we were chatting before, and as you mentioned, a lot of people working in preventing and countering violent extremism themselves don't come from a gaming platform, and I've certainly heard people say I just don't understand it. I don't know how to approach it. What would be your advice for researchers working in these spaces who aren't themselves gamers, who sort of feel under-equipped to work in this area? How might we approach it coming from different backgrounds?
That's a really good question. Actually, within the EGRN, people are quite upfront about their experiences with gaming. Some people used to be gamers in the past and aren't anymore. Some people are active gamers, and some people have kind of only played very basic games on their mobile phones. So we've got a real range of people who are engaged in this area of study, and not being a gamer shouldn't really put you off getting involved in this particular area of study if it's something that interests you. We've got researchers who really bring a wide range of knowledge and understanding and theories and policy-related backgrounds from a number of different areas. So we've got from anthropologists to social psychologists to criminologists to sociologists. And what we're starting to do is not only build up an understanding of what the online space looks like and the exploitation of the online space in real kind of descriptive terms, but actually some of the academics working in this area have started to really understand and look at the motivations behind the use of online gaming spaces and whether those particular spaces offer something different to social media forms in terms of kind of psychology, social psychology, in terms of kind of identity fusion, like my colleague Rachel Cowart looks at. So yeah, I suppose the simple answer is don't let it put you off. I'm a gamer myself. I don't get to game as much as I would like to. The older you get, the more the more responsibilities you have. But yeah, don't let it put you off. It's a real kind of it's a real interesting space, and it's a space that's in its really early stages, and we welcome a whole bunch of new researchers who'd like to get involved.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a couple of questions coming up in the chat. So first, we've got somebody who's asked, how does extremist content and mods on video games differ from mainstream video game content, which is often sort of intrinsically violent, and towards particular countries or groups? So for example, in Call of Duty, towards Russia. So are there, I think sorry.
Yeah, so look, we know that the gaming industry isn't perfect, right? We know that within particular games there is often a focus on particular minorities. We've seen that within some of the kind of first-player shooter games where usually the good guys are the American soldiers and the bad guys are kind of Muslim insurgents, and we've seen the kind of issues that causes across the board. We've seen the kind of sexualization of female characters within gaming across various different games as well. And if I understand the question correctly, there is no real difference actually with the modification as compared to the original game. It uses the same graphics, it uses the same maps, it uses the same characters, sometimes with some changes. It uses the same weapons, and they're still intrinsically violent and extremist towards.
So there is that real issue of the original being open to exploitation. open to modification for an extremist purpose.
Absolutely. The gameplay in most cases, or in many cases, the gameplay looks almost exactly the same, except the character that you're playing with may have changed. Usually with first player shooters, you don't actually see the character, you just see the weapon that they're holding out. But the change is the people that are considered to be, and same in kind of quotes, the enemy, and the modifications we've seen are normally by far right extremists, where you play as either a neo-Nazi or an attacker, either the Buffalo attacker or the Christchurch attacker, or Donald Trump, or Hitler, or somebody else that they've kind of either modded into the gameplay. And
so we are getting
the sets are pretty much the same.
Okay, we are getting more questions than I think we're going to have time to deal with. So I'll just sort of get to a couple of them if we can. So one is there a need for more government regulation to get companies to increase reporting? Has this sort of happened in the UK, in the EU, and is government regulation going to work?
Well, it's it's that kind of age-old question, is it? I suppose we've had so many different regulatory kind of mechanisms across Europe, across the European Union. We've had more recently the UK, in the UK you've had the Online Safety Act, which talks about kind of safety by design, and talks about kind of increasing kind of regulatory powers in terms of targeting particular platforms and providing and asking platforms to be able to deal with propaganda and threats on their platform within a particular amount of time, taking into account smaller platforms and their reach and their ability to be able to deal with things, be able to kind of monitor their platforms as coherently as some of the larger platforms. I suppose the simple answer to this is yes, we do need regulation. I think the regulation that's out there does focus on other online spaces. I do think we need to have regulation that does focus specifically on gaming platforms and gaming adjacent platforms, because although there will be some overlaps with other online spaces, there will be some distinct differences that need to be dealt with either through kind of regulation or policy. But as we've seen with the various different types of regulations across Europe, that's not going to be enough. It needs to be a kind of multi-stakeholder approach, which is particularly led by these gaming companies themselves, where they need to think about how to not only increase user reporting, but also how to increase detection on the millions of different private servers they might have on their own platforms, how to encourage moderators of these private servers to adhere to particular terms and service, even thinking about whether their terms of service and community guidelines are up to date, and whether they're in line with some of the more kind of recent threats as well. And some of that can only be developed by working with relevant kind of policymakers or academics or others working in this space.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one final question. So apologies to those whose questions we haven't got to. So this sort of follows from what you were just saying about moderation. How difficult is making the distinction between persons making horrible statements, so that general sort of toxicity that's increasingly accepted in gaming culture, between those kinds of people and those who are legitimately supportive of ideologically motivated violence, so particularly in young male groups?
So difficult. It's such a I don't have an answer for this, because it's such a difficult area, and it's something that not just within gaming spaces, but across kind of social media as well, we're really now starting to think about. So when we kind of thought about when we think about the jihadist threat, it's not easy to deal with, but the boundaries for me are far clearer than they are at the moment when we're dealing with far-right extremism. And we've seen that recently with the violence across the UK and some of the social media posts that have instigated that violence and come as a result of that violence as well. So, are we dealing with when I say just racism, and that's not to downplay racism, of course, racism is really a very serious issue, but are we dealing with racism or are we dealing with extremism or violent extremism? And that question has become particularly complex when we've seen the normalization and mainstreaming of far-right extremism across the media, across politics, and we've seen that Overton window shifting quite drastically, where things politicians might have said 20 years ago, which would have been absolutely unacceptable, now are deemed to be acceptable and part of kind of mainstream rhetoric and mainstream politics. So then when you have that rhetoric within mainstream society, something that is being repeated by not just politicians, but by media outlets, and we've seen, the Great Replacement theory being talked about in some of the mainstream newspapers around the world. We've heard anchors of very popular, I'm choosing my words very carefully, very popular news stations, particularly in the United States, talking about Great Replacement theory, linking it to, this kind of global cabal, which is a real kind of, dog whistle to anti-Semitism. When we see that in mainstream society, then asking platforms to moderate particular forms of content becomes particularly difficult, especially when people and some groups of people use memes and use other forms of communication to kind of disseminate that propaganda and disseminate those messages. And this is why it's so important for gaming companies to work with researchers and academics like us who more often than not have our finger on the pulse and are conducting research where we understand the kind of nuances, we understand the changes in terminology, we understand some of the buzzwords, we understand some of the subcultural terminology and iconography and images that people are using. So I suppose it goes back to that kind of previous question about what do we do about it? Well, as with all other issues that we see in this area across all our other online spaces, it's only going to be this multi-stakeholder approach that really begins to solve this issue.
All right. Thanks so very much for your presentation and for responding to those questions. As I said, apologies to those whose questions we don't have time to get to today. We are out of time now. So the video of the session will be available on the AVERT website soon. Those of you who are not members or who are not on the mailing list can certainly go again to our website and find information about how to join the list to hear about future events. You can also follow AVERT on LinkedIn or subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is also where the video will be. So thanks again, and please everybody join me in thanking Dr. Lakhani for that really, really helpful presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, and people are welcome to reach out and drop me an email, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards.
Terrific. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.